Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Peter Orner, who's here to share with us his new book, Still No Word From You, Notes in the Margin. Now, Peter is the author of many novels and story collections. His previous collections of essay, Am I Alone Here?, Notes on Living on the Road, and Reading to Live, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism and three-time recipient for the Pushcart Prize. Orner's work has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Paris Review, and many more. He has been awarded the Rome Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a 2-year Lannan Foundation Literary Fellowship, the California Book Award for Fiction, and many more. So let's welcome to the show, Peter Orner.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I know people are just so excited. It's flying off the shelves. I've got it. I just am so impressed with how it's written. So why don't you share a little bit about the inspiration of this book?
Sure. This is I can't believe it. It's my seventh one of these. So it's it's a kind of it's a different one. It's an outlier for me, this book, in a way. It's basically a memoir told through the books that I'm reading. And so, like a lot of people, when I read, something on the page will trigger something in my memory. And then my mind will wander off the page and onto my own page. And I'll sort of almost like relive my life through other people's words, if that makes any sense. That's kind of how this one happened. It was weird.
Well, it makes perfect sense. You hear about people, how music kind of inspires them into different places and times. And I feel that books do the same thing. And I was so impressed, like chapter 6, you talk about, a book that your mother wrote in regards to Chagall. And I thought, oh my goodness, how cool is that?
Yeah, it was. She was young, 20-year-old, recently married, had moved from Chicago to from Massachusetts to Chicago, and she was reading a Lawrence Ferlinghetti book of poetry, and he was writing about Chagall. And Chagall's mother says to Chagall, "Hey, stop writing about that cow." And then she's like, "Don't make that cow fly." And Chagall doesn't listen to her because people don't listen to their mothers, right? And my mother in the margin wrote "yes" with a big explanation point. And I thought it was such an insight into my mother at 20 years old. That would be like an awesome line to her. You know what I mean? And so, that triggered a memory, or an invention, actually, in that case.
Well, it's such a rebel move. It's like, hey, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Just be inspired regardless whatever anyone says,
Exactly.
So what's one memory that really stands out for you?
I'd say the first one. It's actually the first section in the book. I remember, or believe I remember, sitting on the kitchen counter while my mother was doing dishes, and this would have been in 1974, and it was the day that Richard Nixon resigned and left the White House, and his helicopter starts to rise above the White House, which we've seen more recently too. But I remember this, watching it on the black and white TV in the kitchen with my mom. My mom was doing the dishes, and my mom wasn't actually looking at the TV. She was looking out the window. And I was 4. So whether or not, this is a myth or whether or not I actually remember it, I don't know. But the image is in my mind. And I was curious why she wasn't paying attention to the TV. Invention and memory. I think she was thinking about something else. She was thinking about leaving the house she was in.
Well, I do have friends that remember that far back, so I would not be surprised. I think the only thing I remember is my black lab. So, from those times, and it's just interesting the differences on what some people remember, and they have these vivid memories, and other people, it's not really there for them.
It's like a snapshot. I mean, I can imagine, the black lab, like even, like you can see the black lab, right? And so to me, that's a scene. You know what I mean? And all you got to do is sort of, in my case, is spend a little more time in that scene, and then it starts to become in motion. Whether or not it's real is a whole nother story, but it's real to me.
Well, that's all that matters,
Right.
That's so, I mean, as you're writing all these stories, were you just, I mean, I'm sure there are many more that did not make it in the book. I mean, how did you decide which ones would be in the book?
That's a great question. I struggle a lot with that. I like to write brief, concise pieces, and then I like to put them together. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how one piece will play off of another. And in this case, it was really hard. There's 107 pieces in this book. And so I basically, what I do is I print them out and I put them on the floor of my studio. And then I just sort of crawl around on my knees and read them. And then if my eye if it doesn't work, the next one, I'll look at another one and I'll try it and I'll put that in that position. So it's literally physically, I will sort of, it's like a puzzle. And I go for rhythm. I want rhythm, and I want pacing. I want something, if maybe I have a darker piece, then I try and have something, lighter, with more humor, alternating kind of thing.
Well, you can tell it's very thoughtfully brought together. So congratulations. I felt that it was such a beautiful read, bringing that all together. And I know a lot of people is super creative during the pandemic. Is the pandemic maybe a cause that brought this book together?
Definitely. I mean, I mean, I'm somebody, because of what I do, I spend a lot of time alone anyway. I spend hours and hours by myself, sort of, often spinning my wheels. And, it was weird because, a lot more people were doing that. We were all, to a certain extent, a lot of us were more isolated than we'd ever been. And me too. I'm used to being isolated, and I can walk outside my studio and see people. Right. And at that time, I was the only one. I was the only one around. We were on lockdown, and we weren't even supposed to move if you weren't an essential worker, but I can't work at home. So I would, sneak off to my studio, and I'd be the only one on the block, the only one in the building. And it was a strange, silent experience. And I think that it allowed for me to create a, kind of a weird silent book, in the sense that the book is very much a response to silent reading. And that's how it kind of came to be. But I'm somebody who needs and thrives off of interactions, even though I spent a lot of time alone, and I didn't have those interactions. So I had to create them for myself.
Well, it's amazing what your mind will do when you put it to writing and bringing all this together, because I was just, again, so impressed with how this book has come together. And it really does give like a view into a person's life, and has, I would think, other people questioning about like, well, what do I remember from my life?
Right. Right. I mean, I think we are sort of, our memories, right? They make a huge part of who we are. And, I'm like everybody else. I didn't ever stop and really think about them too much. I just kind of carry them around with me. In this case, I tried to what do I remember? And I tried to articulate it differently than I normally would if I was just telling a story to my family or something like that. I wanted to speak to a stranger, I guess.
Why do you think these stories are so important?
I mean, on the one hand, because a lot of this particular book is about the writers that I revere, I was sort of investigating that whole idea. There's so many in here, but I'll just name one. As an Italian Jewish writer, Primo Levi, who survived the Holocaust. And he has a very beautiful memoir called The Periodic Table. It's a book I read often. And I was just thinking about why that book was so important to me and why his life before the Holocaust became of great interest to me. And I, because he was an ordinary guy working in a chemist's office, a chemistry lab, and falling in love, right before the war. And he writes about this so beautifully. And I just was thinking about what it was like to be somebody who then has this incredibly monumental experience, but was just like everybody else, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this particular writer. He comes in at the end, towards the end of the book, where I talk a lot about what it was like to be him, like just kind of an ordinary guy on a bicycle falling in love, and then suddenly thrown into something that he had no idea what was coming. He was in a concentration camp. He was in Auschwitz. And not to bring everything down, but I was trying to think about his life in its totality, right? Because we aren't only made up of the worst things that have happened to us. And so in some ways, I think that was sort of a reigning idea of this book too.
That kind of reminds me as a man thinketh, the whole, our mind is what we are in control of, regardless of what's going on around us.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, and it's simultaneous. We could be doing something totally different, driving, teaching, whatever, being on the radio, right? And we're also other places too. And I'm just always amazed by that, how we can do that. I think we all do it.
Well, I think it really highlights a lot of the writers that most people may not know about their personal lives in such a way. Was there a lot of research that you did into this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the most systematic. I'm not I do teach. I'm a professor at Dartmouth College, but I'm a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer, and I'm somebody who's just kind of works a little bit off the cuff. And so, my research I would dive into a particular writer that I was thinking about, but and I would get some biographical information and understand who those people were. But basically what I was really trying to do was drill down on the particular thing of theirs that I had read. So mostly it really involved rereading, like really intensely, what it was that I was writing about. And so often I'm rereading a scene and just kind of just trying to stay there. Because I think one of the things that happens is, especially in Me Too and everybody, is like you overdo the research and you lose sight of why you started in the first place. Like that really intense moment that you wanted to investigate. So I did a lot more investigation of moments than I did research. If that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. Just understanding how you brought this all together, because it takes such a creative, ingenious mind to bring this together the way that you did, and to make it so, it has such a great flow to it. I think it's very easy for people to read. And I don't know about you, but I could pick one up, pick your book up and just kind of go to any page and read a chapter, and just kind of work as far as meditate on that or think about it throughout the day. And I found that to be just really impactful.
Well, I'm honored that you say that. And that's exactly, I'd love for people to read it in order, but I'd also love people to read it, period. You know what I mean? And it is sort of designed for exactly what you said. It was, hey, I'm just opening this up, and here I am descending into a moment in my life, or again, a moment in another writer's life. And hopefully my hope is that people would go back and sort of see how it all comes together. But absolutely, I love descending into people's lives. I will often open up a book in the middle just to read a scene. I did it this morning.
Oh, good. So I'm not weird in doing that. Okay.
No, whatever it takes to get people to read, I will take it. Read the last page. Fine with
read
me.
Read all the pages. That's what we really want. Well, and with the research that you did, you did quite extensive research, like you were saying. Was there anything that really kind of surprised you?
I'm just trying to think. Like, one of the writers that I write about is Lorraine Hansberry, the great Chicago playwright who died quite young. She's really famous for one play, Raisin in the Sun. But she, right before she died, they produced a play on Broadway called The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window. And it didn't do very well. And people were sort of curious about like why Hansberry, who's sort of like this young phenom who had done Raisin in the Sun, they're like, what's this about? This is about, a couple of white liberals living in Greenwich Village. And there's not a lot of there's only one African-American character in the play. And just people were really curious about it. And I did a lot of research into this play and what was going on in her mind when she wrote it and why she wrote it. And it was just totally fascinating. And when an artist dies young, like Hansberry did, she had these two plays, but of course she would have written many, many others, right? And so the second play was like this example of what this one writer was trying to expand into, that she wasn't going to be limited by the first play, which is totally brilliant. And the movie with Sidney Poitier is awesome. But it just showed me that, like, look, you don't have to be sort of always who you are all the time. You can try something different. And that was one, looking into that particular play. The second play of Hansberry was of great interest to me because it just was a good message for any artist. Like, look, don't be so, don't be repetitive, and B, like, don't be too reliant on what you can do. Try something else, even if it fails. And that play arguably has aspects of failure in it. It's a little boring sometimes, but it's also really interesting. Excuse me.
Well, I think we all learn such great lessons from failures. I think they're just markers in the road telling us to take another look.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what I was just thinking a lot about with this particular work.
So, you went to so many different things. You went to the King Tut exhibition. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's, it's another, the book, if there is a plot, it's like the trajectory of my life from my childhood to, growing up and, getting married, getting divorced, getting remarried, having kids, normal life stuff. But throughout my remembering and putting this book together, just these little moments would come to my mind. And I remembered going to the King Tut exhibit with my mother, excuse me, and waiting in line. And the line snaked like, half a mile down Michigan Avenue in Chicago. And I was just remembering just waiting in line, more than seeing the stuff. And then I started to remember that where I was standing on the corner waiting for the King Tut exhibit, across the street was Roosevelt University, where an uncle of mine who died very young went to college and got an accounting degree. And he was a nobody, right? And nobody was, and for some reason in my mind, I sort of started to compare King Tut to my Uncle Irwin. And it just grew into a piece about, the natures of trajectories in lives. Some people get to be a boy king with lots of gold in their tomb, and others die in a cheap suit from Sears at 45, having a heart attack on a subway. It's just, I don't know. Life is weird, I guess. It's pretty obvious, but it struck me as being that no one had ever compared my Uncle Irwin to King Tut. So I wanted to be the one to do it.
Well, I'm glad you did. And it just says how just remarkable your mind was at such a young age as well, to make those kind of comparisons and look at things in such a different way.
Yeah, and if only we could go back to those times, right? And be that young person who picked up on stuff and didn't think, oh, that's too weird to explore, right? A kid would think that was totally normal.
Well, thank goodness for kids. That's all I can say. Well, and you have your book set up. It's morning, mid-morning, noon, 3 p.m., dusk, night. So why is it set up that way?
Like any writer, I struggle with structure. And as I was working on these, they started to just keep piling up. And one of the pieces is about a book that a poet named Bernadette Mayer. She wrote the book. It's about a 120-page book. She wrote it in a single day, and it's an accounting of everything she did that day, including waking up her kids, making breakfast, making lunch, making spaghetti, talking to her husband, taking out the garbage. It's and yet, like we already talked about, like her mind is also totally elsewhere, right? She's a poet, so she's remembering stuff, or she's, creating stuff as out of her own imagination, or it's a book that tracks someone's minds and actions over the course of one day. Truly remarkable. It's called Midwinter Day. And it just struck me as, how much is in a day? If you actually really broke it down and thought about it, how many literally lives are we living in one day? And I was thinking, well, I could then, maybe I could structure a book in that similar way, in a sense of sort of, kind of moving through the day through memory and through reading in the same sort of way, at least inspired by this Mayer book.
That's awesome. That's pretty awesome how that all came together.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great, you can't believe how she did it. And I sort of, I'm tipping my hat to Mayer, in some ways.
Awesome. Love it. You read all these great books. You talk about poetry and plays and novels and stories and memoirs. So why don't you share with us about your reading habits? What are those like?
Haphazard. I even though I teach and I have to be somewhat organized when I do so, I'm all in favor of like reading whatever you want whenever you have time. And I really resent when people say, well, you got to read this, or you got to read that, or in order to know about this, you have to read this. And I'm like, no, I don't. I can, my mind is drawn to what I feel like reading. If I want to read today about Egypt, I will. If I want to read tomorrow about Dublin, I will. If I want to read the next day about celebrities, I will. And I just, I'm kind of all over the place. And I'm just like, I walk into my studio, there's books all over, and I'll just pick one up you go into a whole nother universe right there. And maybe it's a little crazy, maybe it's a little frenetic, but it seems to work sometimes in the sense of I just get so many ideas by the disparate books that I read, but there's no program, right? And I don't believe that there really should be when you study literature seriously or unseriously. There should really be no, it's about stories, period, wherever they take place, whenever they were written. So I'll read something that's, 19th century novel, and then I'll read a contemporary poet, and I'll sometimes get similar things out of them. It's about stories, about details, about rhythm, and I feel like sometimes we make reading too academic, people like me, unfortunately. And I really try and, at least in my own life, work against that. And I try and encourage my students too, to like, look, don't always listen to me. Yes, do my assigned reading, because otherwise I'll flunk you, but always have something else you're reading that I didn't tell you to read, always.
What books are you reading?
Right now I am reading a biography of Charles Dickens, which is wonderful. He says at one point, I think I read this morning, he said, he's writing in his own diary to himself. He says, less speech is more work. I was like, okay. Less speech is more work. That's it. I'm reading, rereading To the Lighthouse, which I left out in the rain the other day. So now I'm waiting for it to dry. Or maybe I should get another one out of the library. And I'm reading a strange and beautiful Israeli novel called Mr. Mani, which is basically recordings, printed recordings of one-sided conversations over the course of 6 generations. So 2 people, but you only read one side of the conversation 6 different times over 6 generations. It's you're like, who could have thought of that? As a structure for a book. So again, I guess it shows you I'm all over the place.
It just shows that you have varied interests. And I think writers and readers like to hear about that, because it's not like, if you're, reading self-help or novels or whatever, it's not like you're just stuck in one genre.
Right. And I sometimes feel hamstrung by even the idea of a genre itself. There can be brilliant books in any genre, including self-help, etc. Right. I mean, there are some great, contributions to thinking in every corner of the literary universe, and so I'm always looking, and I try not to be too into borders.
So, what are your writing habits like? I mean, I can just guess with you being as busy as you are, getting this book together. I mean, when do you have time to write? And you're teaching? My goodness,
And I got a couple of kids too, so it's
Oh, yeah,
busy.
let's add that to the list, right?
Yeah. I wake up early. I try to get up as early as I can, and I have a couple hours of quiet. And when I'm not teaching, I go to a studio, which is great to get out of the house, and a little studio in an old hotel in White River Junction, Vermont, near where I live. And I spend a lot of time in there. And I try not to put too much pressure on myself. I do a lot of reading. I do more reading than I do writing. But oftentimes the reading, as in this book's case, it inspires, my own words, right? But I always, for me, reading really is part of my job. So it's built in, and I understand that not everybody has time for that. But for me, it's work. It's wonderful work, but it's work.
Well, that's when you've got something that brings out the passion within a person. It's finding something they love and love doing.
Yeah, I'm lucky in that sense. If I had a different job, I'm sure I'd be pretty unhappy. So I feel pretty blessed that I can do what the only thing that I kind of was put here to do, I think.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, your list of accolades is, insanely long, and everyone loves your work, and I can easily see why. My goodness, Peter. I mean, you're such an inspiration. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Sure. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and I think I have an Insta thing, but I'm not sure it's working at the moment. My handle is like social media incompetent, but I'm trying. I'm getting better, and I'm actually really enjoying interacting with people on this new book. And I have a website. It's peterorner.com, ORNER, and easy to find there. And I welcome people's messages, and it's a lonely business I'm in. So when a book comes out and I'm able to have this conversation publicly, I really enjoy it. So I look forward to hearing from people.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, thank you, Marianne. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. It's really got me so thinking about so many things. I'm actually psyched to go back to work. Now I've got some ideas.
Well, thank you, Peter. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Still No Word From You, Notes in the Margin. Still No Word From You is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it, and of course, support our indie bookstores. Also, remember to visit Peter's website, learn more about his work, and be part of his community. Well, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.